Imagine this for a moment. You're 85 years old, you've survived war, migration, and decades of hard work. You raised a family, buried a wife, and finally reached that stage of life where all you want is peace and quiet. Your biggest daily worry is remembering what time to take your medication. You live on a quiet street in North Ryde, a place most people would describe as ordinary, safe, boring even. It's not the kind of suburb that makes the nightly news. But at 5 a.m. on a warm Friday morning, that illusion of safety is shattered in the most violent way possible. Your front door explodes inward. Heavy boots thunder down the hallway, strange voices in the dark, faces you can't properly make out, hands grabbing at you before you can even find your glasses. You're dragged out of bed, forced out into the cold air, pushed into the back of a dark SUV. And here is the detail that turns this from a crime into a nightmare. They didn't even want you. They wanted someone else, another man with other enemies in another house. They got the wrong grandfather. Now, most people hear wrong person and assume that means the situation gets corrected, that the offenders panic, realize the risk, and dump the victim somewhere safe. That there's at least one moment where humanity, self-interest, or pure survival instinct forces them to undo the damage. But in this case, police say Chris Baghsarian was taken by mistake, and what followed wasn't a frantic attempt to fix it. What followed was a sequence of decisions that ended with an 85-year-old man dead, and a community left staring at their own front doors thinking, if it can happen to him, why not to any of us? This is the story of Chris Baghsarian, an 85-year-old Sydney grandfather who police say was kidnapped by mistake, held captive, and murdered in one of the most disturbing ransom plots Australia has seen in years. It's a story about organised crime culture, catastrophic error, and the kind of cold moral shutdown that turns a human being into a problem to be managed. And I want you to stay with me because I'm not just going to run the timeline. I want to show you what the timeline means, where the leverage was, where the exits were, where the choices were made. Because a crime like this isn't one single act. It's a chain. And somewhere along that chain, someone decided an innocent old man couldn't be allowed to walk away. Before we go any further, drop a comment below and tell me what city you're watching from. Are you in Sydney? Somewhere else in Australia? Or are you overseas? I genuinely read these, and it helps me understand who is on the other side of this screen. And if you're into deep dives that don't spoon feed you in 3 minutes, hit subscribe and turn on the bell, because we cover cases properly here. And we follow the updates when the headlines move on. All right, let's go back to North Ryde before dawn, when the world is quiet and people still believe their suburb is separated from the underworld by nothing more than a postcode. North Ryde is not the place Australians picture when they think kidnapping. It's leafy, residential, brick homes, tidy gardens, people who complain more about traffic than crime. It's the kind of suburb where danger feels theoretical, something on the news, something that happens somewhere else. And that belief is exactly what this crime exploited. A pre-dawn home invasion works best when victims and neighbours are still asleep, still slow, still assuming the simplest explanation for anything they hear. Chris Baghsarian, by public accounts, wasn't living the kind of life that attracts violent criminal attention. He was elderly, widowed, living alone. Family described him as gentle and harmless. No public record of serious criminal ties, no obvious motive sitting in his personal story. And when investigators reached the conclusion that he wasn't the intended target, it answered one question but opened a more terrifying one. If he was taken by mistake, then the real danger wasn't something he did. The real danger was proximity. The wrong neighbour, the wrong street, the wrong door. Police believe the intended target was another man linked to Sydney's organised crime scene, a person with alleged connections that can generate enemies, debts and retaliation. That detail matters because it tells you how two completely different worlds can exist side by side without most residents ever seeing the seam. One world is quiet retirement, medication schedules, family visits. The other world is disputes, threats, pressure, reputation. The kind of world where violence isn't a last resort, it's a tool. And in this case, those worlds collided at 5 a.m. In the early hours of that Friday morning, neighbours later reported unusual noises, a loud bang consistent with forced entry, raised voices, then the sound of a vehicle pulling away quickly. CCTV in the area later showed figures approaching from a dark vehicle. In the half-light, one appears dressed in a way that could pass for workwear at a glance, not necessarily because they were trying to be invisible, but because they were trying to be explainable. Offenders don't always need you to see nothing. Sometimes they just need you to hesitate. They need you to think, maybe it's a tradie, maybe it's a family argument, maybe it's not my business. Because that 5-second delay is the gap where a kidnapping becomes a disappearance. Inside the house, Chris was alone. That fact is crucial. It means no second person to slow the intruders down, no spouse to call 000 from another room, no adult child to intervene. The offenders could take control immediately. They forced entry, got hands on him, and moved fast. And speed is the signature of an abduction that's been rehearsed, at least in concept. The goal is not to search the home. The goal is to extract the person. A person can talk back. A person can call. A person can create chaos. So you remove the person and you remove the problem. He was dragged from his bed in pyjamas. No time for shoes. No time for medication. No time to orient himself. For an 85-year-old, that's not just frightening. It's physically destabilizing. Stress alone can be lethal in someone vulnerable. Add deprivation of medication, rough handling, shock, exposure, and suddenly time becomes a weapon. Not even intentionally, just by neglect. From a behavioral perspective, two things stand out. First, the boldness. A residential kidnapping at dawn is high risk, high confidence. Second, the bluntness. This isn't the profile of careful, meticulous offenders who minimize exposure. This looks like people relying on intimidation and momentum. The belief that fear will keep everyone quiet and delay the response long enough for them to get away clean. But here's the cruel irony. Momentum is also what creates mistakes. When you move fast, you accept uncertainty. And if police are right, the uncertainty was fatal. Soon after the abduction, messages and images began circulating in underworld channels, not to Chris's family, but reportedly to contacts connected with the man police believe was the intended target. These communications included images of an elderly man in what looked like a makeshift holding location, injured, still wearing the pajamas he was taken in. That detail is more than horrific. It's revealing. Because pajamas are a symbol of home, safety, routine. And the offenders were using that image as proof of control. They weren't just holding a hostage, they were performing dominance. Alongside the images, police say they are investigating messages demanding an enormous sum, around $50 million. And let me be precise here, because accuracy matters. The reporting around this case indicates that Chris's family did not receive a ransom demand. The messages were directed elsewhere, toward people linked to the suspected intended target. That distinction changes how we understand the plan. It wasn't kidnap a man and pressure his family. It was kidnap a man and pressure an underworld adjacent contact. It's extortion logic, not family ransom logic. And that is exactly why the mistaken identity becomes so lethal. Because if you snatch the wrong person, you don't just lose leverage, you create a liability. Imagine being on the receiving end of those messages in that underworld network. You see an elderly man in pajamas, you know instantly, that is not our person. This is not the intended target. This is not a clean bargaining chip. It's an innocent civilian, which means the kidnapping has already spiraled into something far more dangerous than the offenders planned. Now, in a purely pragmatic criminal mindset, that should be the end. Release him. Dump him somewhere safe. Run. Because every extra hour increases exposure. Every extra act increases the criminal seriousness. Every extra decision multiplies the consequences. But police say the offenders realized the mistake and did not immediately release him. And that's the pivot point. The moment where the crime changes its moral category. Messages reportedly captured the moment the offenders acknowledged they had the wrong person, and the conversation shifted to what to do next. Public reporting has paraphrased this in brutal terms, suggesting the offenders weighed whether to kill him or keep negotiating. Whether the exact phrasing is word for word accurate matters less than what police say it indicates. They knew, and they still didn't let him go. That moment tells you something about how certain offenders think. In criminology, there's a concept called moral disengagement, the internal process where people detach actions from empathy, detach consequences from responsibility, and start seeing human beings as objects, hostage, asset, leverage, liability. Those words aren't just descriptors, they're psychological shields. They allow someone to look at an 85-year-old man and not see a grandfather. They see a risk, and once the victim becomes a risk, the offender's logic becomes brutally simple. A living victim can identify you. A living victim can describe you. A living victim can trigger a response that pulls your whole network into the light. The wrong person isn't safer. The wrong person is more dangerous to the offenders. This is why mistaken identity doesn't create mercy. It creates panic. And panic, in the hands of people already comfortable with violence, becomes lethal. I want to put a question to you right now because it exposes the core of how we think about crime. Once you know you've taken the wrong person, is there any justification left? Any scenario at all where you do not release them immediately? Comment yes or no and tell me why. Because your answer reveals what you believe is still possible in human behavior once fear and self-preservation take over. While these communications were circulating, police made public appeals in unusually direct terms. They stated they believed Chris was taken by mistake. They emphasized his vulnerability. They urged whoever had him to drop him somewhere safe, no questions asked, before it was too late. That kind of statement is not just a plea, it's a tactic. Police are speaking to offenders through the media, offering an exit ramp, a way to step back without being immediately crushed. But an exit ramp only works if offenders believe they can survive taking it. If they believe police are already close, or if they believe releasing the victim increases their chance of being identified, they may decide the safest option is the most immoral one. That's a sick logic, but it's a logic that appears again and again in crimes where victims are moved, held, and then killed. As the investigation intensified, Strike Force Chobat was formed to coordinate the search and the criminal intelligence picture. And this is where the timeline becomes more than a sequence of events, because modern investigations don't solve cases through one piece of evidence. They solve them through convergence, CCTV, phone data, vehicle movements, witness statements, forensic traces, and the behavioural patterns offenders can't help leaving behind. Those patterns began pointing towards Sydney's semi-rural fringe. Durrell, a location investigators believe was connected to the holding phase of the crime and possibly where those images were recorded. Durrell makes operational sense for offenders. It offers space, fewer immediate eyes, properties with sheds or outbuildings, and enough access to move quickly if something goes wrong. It's not remote wilderness, it's concealment within reach. And that matters because it suggests offenders who want to be hidden but not isolated. People who need to move. Then comes the clean-up behaviour. The kind of thing offenders do when they believe the trail is heating up. A stolen Toyota Corolla believed to be linked to the kidnapping was later found burned out near Westmead. Here's why this detail matters psychologically. Criminals burn vehicles because they believe fire erases identity. They picture destruction as deletion. But forensic reality isn't that neat. Burnout vehicles still carry timelines, still carry movement history, still link back to theft events, still connect to CCTV coverage on roads and service stations. Burning a car is less professional erasure and more panic management. And police have indicated something else that sharpens the timeline in a particularly grim way. Reporting on this case has indicated investigators believe the vehicle was in the Pitttown area as early as the Saturday night after the kidnapping, meaning the movement toward the eventual dump site may have happened very early, while public appeals were still unfolding. That possibility makes the cruelty of the case even harder to process because it suggests the public hope and the behind-the-scenes reality may have diverged quickly. Eventually, about 11 days after the abduction, police located human remains near a golf club in Pitttown and confirmed they were Chris Baghsarian. Investigators believe he may have been killed earlier, possibly linked to the Durrell holding location, and later moved. That final act, transporting and leaving a body in bushland, is not just disposal. It's an attempt to control narrative, to delay discovery, to buy time, to create uncertainty. And that brings us to the central truth of this case. It wasn't one bad moment. It was a chain of decisions. The wrong door, the extraction, the communications, the realization of mistake, the refusal to release, the movement, the burning of a vehicle, the dumping of remains. When we say organised crime, people imagine sophistication, like a machine that runs perfectly. But this case, as police describe it, looks more like something else. A crew willing to use violence, operating with enough contacts and audacity to attempt a high-end extortion, but not enough discipline to manage a crisis once they created one. That combination is deadly, because disciplined criminals might cut losses. Undisciplined criminals panic and escalate. And escalation is where innocent people die. Now, suspects have been charged, and the case moves into the legal phase where every person's role becomes the battlefield. Who forced entry? Who drove? Who held him? Who sent messages? Who made which decision and when? And this is where the wrong target detail becomes legally and morally important, because mistaken identity does not reduce culpability. If anything, it increases the moral gravity. It's the difference between a victim chosen and a victim caught. And when you continue after discovering the mistake, the crime becomes not only violent but deliberate in its disregard. For Chris's family, none of that courtroom language will undo what happened. An 85-year-old man who survived a lifetime deserved a quiet ending. Instead, he was dragged from bed at dawn and never came home. That is the human core beneath every police statement and every court mention. And for the rest of us watching, especially Australians who still carry that quiet belief that home is a fortress, this case forces an uncomfortable question. We tell ourselves organised crime happens to those people, that it stays within its own world. But this case suggests something harsher. Sometimes organised crime spills over, not because you're involved, but because you're nearby. Because you share a street with someone you don't really know. Because criminals under pressure don't see innocent, they see problem. So here's what I want to leave you with tonight. If this happened on your street, if an elderly neighbour was taken at 5 a.m. and later found dead, would you still trust the feeling of safety your suburb gives you? Or would you realise safety is often a story we tell ourselves until the wrong people decide to test it? Comment what detail hit you hardest. The wrong door mistake, the underworld-style messaging, the size of the demand, the early movement toward Pit Town, or the fact that once they realised they had the wrong man, there still wasn't mercy. If you want more deep, structured breakdowns like this, subscribe and stay with the channel. Because cases like this don't end when the headlines stop. The real story is what they reveal about criminals, decision-making, and the thin line between the life you think you're living and the world operating right beside it. Take care of yourselves, lock your doors, look out for your neighbours, and I'll see you in the next one.